Veltar stood at the window of the War Council chamber, looking out at the peaceful streets of Keth Prime. 50 years had passed since the ceasefire at Earth, but the real truth behind the war's end had never been officially recorded. "Everything I've told you about human tactics and sacrifice is accurate," he said, "but there was something else. Something I discovered only after the fighting stopped." Admiral Kixlan and the other young officers waited in silence. They had heard stories of impossible battles, of humans who turned death into a weapon, of civilians who became warriors. But they sensed that Veltar's final revelation would be different. 3 months after the ceasefire, I was assigned to oversee prisoner exchanges and territorial negotiations. Veltar continued. My first meeting was with a young human diplomat named Kite, who had been captured during the siege of Kepler Station. Kite was barely old enough for military service, but he had volunteered for diplomatic duties during the final year of the war. He had been taken prisoner while attempting to negotiate civilian evacuations from contested worlds. During our conversations, Kite said something that changed my understanding of everything we had fought about. Veltar said. He was talking about his family back on Earth, and he mentioned that his sister lived on a colony world called New Harmony. The name was familiar. Veltar had reviewed intelligence reports on New Harmony during the war. It was supposed to be a small agricultural settlement with minimal strategic value. I asked Kite about New Harmony, expecting to hear about farming and mining operations, Veltar said. Instead, he told me about a community where humans and other species lived together as equals. Refugees from the war had settled there alongside human colonists. This was the first hint of something that intelligence reports had missed completely. Human colonies weren't just human anymore. Kite showed me photographs from his sister's letters. Veltar continued. Humans working alongside Villani traders, Rishan scientists, even some Keth civilians who had fled the war. All living together, sharing resources, building something new. Veltar had assumed this was an isolated case, but Kite mentioned dozens of other colonies with similar mixed populations. The human expansion into space hadn't been conquest. It had been invitation. That's when I realized why our intelligence about human settlements was always inaccurate, Veltar said. We were counting human ships and human soldiers, but we weren't counting the non-human populations that had chosen to live under human protection. The implications were staggering. Every human colony that the Keth military had planned to capture or destroy contained populations from multiple species. Many of those species had treaties or trade relationships with the Keth Empire. If we had proceeded with our original war plan, we would have killed thousands of Keth civilians who had chosen to live in human space, Veltar explained. We would have destroyed Villani trade centers, Rishan research stations, and refugee settlements from a dozen different species. But the revelation went deeper than simple population counts. Kite explained that human colonies operated on principles that were fundamentally different from Keth imperial governance. Human settlements were based on something they called consent of the governed, Veltar said. Every resident, regardless of species, had a voice in community decisions. Every family, whether human or alien, had the same rights and protections. This wasn't just political theory. It was practical policy that had created unprecedented prosperity and stability. Mixed species communities were more innovative, more resilient, and more economically successful than single-species settlements. Kite's sister lived in a house designed by Rishan architects, ate food grown using Villani agricultural techniques, and worked in a research facility where humans and aliens collaborated on projects that none of them could complete alone, Veltar said. The war had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The Keth Empire had been fighting to prevent human expansion, but humans hadn't been expanding. They had been creating something entirely new. I asked Kite why humans shared their worlds with other species, Veltar said. Why they gave aliens equal rights in human space. His answer was simple. Because we're all people. We all want the same things: safety for our families, opportunity for our children, and hope for the future. This was the moment when Veltar truly understood human warfare. Humans hadn't been fighting to defend their territory or their species. They had been fighting to defend an idea. the idea that different peoples could live together in peace and prosperity. Every battle, every sacrifice, every desperate last stand was about protecting communities that represented the future both species claimed to want, Veltar said. Humans were fighting for the right to build something better than the galaxy we had known. After his conversation with Kai-Te, Veltar requested permission to visit some of the mixed colonies. What he found there changed his perspective on everything the war had been about. On New Harmony, I met a Keth engineer named Torval, who had been living there for 3 years, Veltar said. He had fled the Empire after his family was killed in a mining accident that could have been prevented with better safety equipment. Torval explained that human colonies prioritized worker safety over production quotas. They used advanced technology not to maximize profits, but to protect people. His new job was safer, better paid, and more respected than anything he could have found in Keth space. I asked Torval if he missed the Empire, Veltar said. He showed me pictures of his new family, a human woman he had married and 2 children they were raising together. He said, "This is the Empire I choose to serve now." Similar stories emerged from every mixed colony Veltar visited. Refugees from wars, victims of persecution, workers seeking better opportunities, scientists wanting to pursue forbidden research, all finding homes in human space where their contributions were valued regardless of their species. The human expansion wasn't conquest, Veltar realized. It was the largest rescue operation in galactic history. They were offering sanctuary to anyone who needed it, regardless of where they came from or what they believed. But the most shocking discovery came when Veltar visited Earth itself. The human homeworld wasn't the military fortress he had expected. It was a museum. Earth had become a living archive of galactic culture, he said. Every species that had ever made contact with humans had established cultural centers, research institutes, and educational facilities on the human homeworld. The planet that the Keth had planned to destroy contained the largest collection of alien art, literature, science, and philosophy in the galaxy. Destroying Earth would have been an act of cultural genocide against dozens of species. I walked through districts where Keth musicians performed for human audiences, where human children learned to read Villani poetry, where Rishan mathematicians collaborated with human engineers on projects that could benefit every species in the galaxy, Veltar said. This was why Last Stand Protocol had been so terrifying. The humans hadn't just been willing to die for their freedom, they had been willing to die for the preservation of galactic civilization itself. In the center of Earth's capital city, there's a memorial garden, Veltar said. It honors every species that had ever suffered under imperial oppression. Keth names are included alongside human names, remembering victims of our own empire's expansion. The garden contained plants from hundreds of worlds, representing the diversity of life that humans were committed to protecting. At the center was a simple inscription in every known galactic language. All people deserve to choose their own destiny. That's when I understood why I had really called for the ceasefire, Veltar said. Not because humans were willing to die, but because they were living for something worth dying for. They had created proof that the galaxy could be better than it was. Admiral Kixelon looked confused. Are you saying the war was about political philosophy? I'm saying the war was about the future, Veltar replied. The Keth Empire represented the past, expansion through conquest, prosperity through exploitation, order through oppression. Humans represented something different, growth through cooperation, wealth through innovation, peace through justice. The ceasefire had given both sides time to consider which future they wanted to build. The choice became obvious once people saw the alternatives. Within 5 years of the war's end, more than 1 million Keth civilians had emigrated to human colonies, Veltar said. Not as conquered subjects, but as equal citizens in communities that valued their contributions. The transformation wasn't limited to individuals. Entire Keth worlds had voted to leave the Empire and join the Human Confederation. They were attracted not by human military power, but by human principles of governance. The Empire began to collapse not because we lost battles, but because our own people preferred human values to imperial ones, Veltar explained. Democracy proved more attractive than autocracy. Individual rights proved more appealing than state power. Today, 50 years after the war ended, the galaxy looked completely different. The Keth Empire still existed, but it had reformed itself to compete with human principles rather than human ships. We gave our people more freedom because that was the only way to prevent them from leaving for human space, Veltar said. We improved. The final battle of the war was supposed to be the easiest victory in Keth military history. After 7 years of fighting, the Empire had assembled the largest armada ever seen, 50,000 ships carrying enough firepower to sterilize entire worlds. The plan was simple, Veltar said. Strike at Earth itself. Destroy the human homeworld and break their will to fight. Intelligence estimated that shocking the humans with the loss of their birthplace would cause immediate surrender. Across all colonies, the Keth High Command had grown frustrated with the war's length and cost. Despite winning most individual battles, they couldn't seem to break human resistance. Every victory led to new human tactics, new forms of sacrifice, new reasons to keep fighting. Fleet Admiral Chang Min commanded Earth's defenses, Veltar continued. He had maybe 3,000 ships, most of them converted civilian vessels with volunteer crews. The mathematical odds were impossible. We outnumbered them nearly 17-1. But Veltar had learned to be suspicious when humans faced impossible odds. 7 years of fighting had taught him that humans did their most dangerous thinking when defeat seemed certain. The human fleet deployed in standard defensive formations around Earth's moon, he said. Captain So Young commanded the battleship, Incheon Rising. Commander Jin Ho led a squadron of escort carriers. Even civilian captains like Haiwan and Sang Ho brought their converted merchant ships to join the defense. What followed wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. It was a mathematical demonstration of human priorities. Fleet Admiral Chang Min broadcast a message to our entire armada, Veltar said. He thanked us for bringing such a large force to Earth. Then he announced something called Last Stand Protocol and explained what it meant. The humans had calculated their odds of victory and found them to be essentially zero. In a normal military situation, this would lead to surrender, negotiations, or strategic withdrawal, but humans had developed a third option. Chang Min said that Earth was worth any sacrifice, Veltar explained. He said that every human ship would be used as a guided missile. Every crew member would die to destroy as many Keth vessels as possible. They were turning their entire defense fleet into suicide weapons. The protocol was more sophisticated than simple ramming attacks. Human engineers had modified their ships' reactor systems to create controlled explosions that maximized damage to enemy vessels. Each ship became a precisely calculated kinetic weapon. Chang Min led the first wave personally, Veltar said. His flagship, the Soul Guardian, accelerated to maximum velocity and rammed straight through our command ships' shields. The explosion destroyed 3 Keth battleships and crippled 2 more. What made the tactic terrifying was its efficiency. Human commanders had studied Keth ship designs and identified the most vulnerable points for ramming attacks. They had calculated approach vectors that would allow single human ships to damage multiple Keth vessels. Captain So Young turned the Incheon Rising into a kinetic projectile that punched through the shields of 3 of our heavy cruisers, Veltar continued. Commander Jin Ho's escort carrier somehow managed to take out an entire destroyer squadron through what the humans called aggressive docking procedures. Even civilian vessels became weapons of war. Merchant Captain Myung Ho used his converted freighter, the New Soul, to destroy a Keth supply convoy by ramming the ammunition ship at the center of the formation. The civilian crews were the most disturbing, Veltar admitted. These were people who had never been soldiers, shop owners, farmers, teachers, retired workers, but they flew their ships into our battle lines with the same determination as veteran military officers. The psychological impact on Keth forces was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had expected an easy victory found themselves facing an enemy that treated certain death as a tactical advantage. Our crews began to panic, Veltar said. They realized that every human ship they destroyed was a victory that cost us multiple vessels in return. The mathematics of attrition were working in humanity's favor, even though they were losing every individual engagement. By the end of the first day, the Keth Armada had lost 30,000 ships. The human defense fleet was reduced to fewer then 200 vessels, but they continued broadcasting the same message. Next wave ready, send more ships. That's when I understood the true horror of Last Stand Protocol, Veltar said. The humans weren't fighting to win the battle. They were fighting to make victory so expensive that we would question whether it was worth achieving. The remaining human ships arranged themselves in a final defensive line between the Keth fleet and Earth. 200 vessels against 20,000. The odds were still hopeless, but the humans showed no sign of surrender. Fleet Admiral Chang Min's final message is recorded in our military archives, Veltar said. He thanked his crews for their service and reminded them that Earth held 4 billion people who were counting on their sacrifice. Then he said something that still gives me nightmares. Chang Min had announced that Earth itself was prepared to implement Last Stand Protocol. The entire planet had been rigged as a weapon. If the Keth fleet proceeded with orbital bombardment, the humans would detonate their homeworld rather than let it be conquered. He wasn't bluffing, Veltar said. Quietly, our sensors detected massive energy buildups around Earth's major cities. The humans had turned their planetary infrastructure into a planet-killing weapon. They were prepared to destroy their own homeworld, to deny us the victory. The implications were staggering. 4 billion human civilians were willing to die rather than become Keth subjects. An entire species had chosen extinction over defeat. That's when I realized we had already lost the war, Veltar said. Not the battle, but the war itself. We could destroy every human ship, bombard every human world, kill every human civilian, but we could never defeat their willingness to sacrifice everything rather than surrender their freedom. Admiral Kixlan looked pale. What did you do? I called for a general ceasefire, Veltar replied. I used my authority as fleet commander to halt all offensive operations and opened communication with human leadership. The decision violated direct orders from Keth High Command, but Veltar no longer cared about military protocol. He had realized something that his superiors back home didn't understand. Winning the Battle of Seoul would have been the beginning of our defeat, not the end of our victory, he explained. If we destroyed Earth, we would face 400 human colonies motivated by the desire to avenge their homeworld. Each of those colonies had learned the same tactics, the same willingness to sacrifice, the same dedication to freedom that we had seen at Earth. The ceasefire negotiations took place in the wreckage of the battle zone. Human and Keth representatives met aboard a neutral space station while debris from destroyed ships drifted past the windows. Chang Min attended the talks personally, even though his flagship had been destroyed in the first wave, Veltar said. He had somehow survived the ramming attack and been rescued by one of the remaining human ships. During the negotiations, Chang Min explained the logic behind Last Stand Protocol. It wasn't just a desperate tactic, it was a strategic philosophy that made conquest of human territory essentially impossible. He said that humans would rather die free than live as subjects, Veltar recounted. Every world we conquered would become a potential weapon. Every population we occupied would become a resistance movement. Every victory would cost us more, then defeat would cost them. The mathematics were undeniable. The Keth Empire could probably win a war of complete extermination against humanity, but they would lose so many ships and soldiers in the process that other species would see them as weakened and vulnerable. Conquering humanity would have destroyed our ability to defend our existing territory, Veltar said. We would have won a victory that guaranteed our eventual defeat by someone else. The ceasefire became a permanent peace treaty within months. Both sides were exhausted by 7 years of warfare, but more importantly, both sides had learned to respect each other's determination. The final lesson I learned about human warfare is that they fight not just to win, but to make their enemies understand that conquest is impossible, Veltar said. They weaponize their own willingness to sacrifice everything, turning their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. He paused and looked around the room at the young officers. Last Stand Protocol was never about military tactics, he continued. It was about sending a message to every potential enemy in the galaxy. Humans will die before they surrender their freedom. Any species that tries to conquer them will pay a price that makes victory meaningless. Admiral Kixlan set down his stylus. Are you saying we should fear humans? No, Veltar replied. I'm saying we should respect them. There's a difference between an enemy you defeat and an enemy you learn to understand. Humans taught us that some things are worth any sacrifice, and that knowledge makes both species stronger. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications. But there's one more truth I need to share with you, Veltar said. The most important lesson of all. It's about what I discovered after the war ended, and why I believe humans were always destined to change the galaxy. The young officers leaned forward, eager to hear the final revelation that the fourth story took place on Halo 7, a small moon that became the site of the largest ground battle in the war. Veltar had been given command of the entire Keth ground force, with orders to capture human mining facilities and eliminate all resistance. Halo 7 had strategic mineral deposits that both sides needed, Veltar explained. The humans had established mining operations with about 20,000 workers and 5,000 military personnel. Intelligence said it would be an easy victory. The battle began as expected. Keth forces had superior numbers, better equipment, and orbital support. Human defenders fought bravely, but were steadily pushed back into defensive positions around the main mining complex. After 2 weeks of fighting, we controlled most of the moon's surface, Veltar said. The remaining humans were trapped in a valley with limited supplies and no hope of reinforcement. Victory seemed certain. But during the 3rd week, Keth forces made an unexpected discovery. Hidden in a natural cave system, they found a human field hospital operated by Dr. Su Jin and her medical team. The hospital was treating wounded soldiers from both sides, Veltar said. Human and Keth casualties were lying in beds next to each other, receiving equal care from human doctors and nurses. This violated everything Veltar understood about warfare. Enemy medical facilities were supposed to treat enemy soldiers, not provide aid to opposing forces. I went to investigate personally, Veltar continued. Dr. Su Jin was performing surgery on a young Keth warrior who had been badly injured by artillery fire. Her assistants, Jae Won and Yoon Hee, were helping wounded Keth soldiers eat and take medicine. When Veltar confronted Dr. Su Jin about treating enemy soldiers, her response was simple and direct. The wounded have no species. They only have pain. The hospital had been operating for weeks without Keth knowledge. Human medics had been secretly collecting wounded Keth soldiers from battlefields and bringing them to the cave for treatment. They had detailed files on Keth physiology and had developed effective treatments for injuries that Keth military doctors struggled to handle. The paradox was obvious, Veltar said. These humans had information about Keth biology that could have been used to create more effective weapons. Instead, they used it to save Keth lives. Dr. Su Jin showed Veltar around the facility. Human and Keth patients shared rooms, meals, and recreational activities. Language barriers were overcome through simple drawings and basic sign language. Children from human families played games with young Keth soldiers while they recovered. I watched a human child teaching a Keth warrior how to fold paper into animal shapes, Veltar said. The soldier had lost his dominant arm in battle, and the child was helping him learn to use his remaining hands for precise movements. They couldn't speak each other's languages, but they understood kindness. The medical records were even more disturbing from a military perspective. Dr. Su Jin had detailed intelligence on Keth troop positions, supply lines, and tactical plans. Wounded Keth soldiers had shared information while delirious from pain medication or grateful for medical treatment. She knew everything, Veltar said. Where our ammunition was stored, when our supply convoys arrived, which units were at reduced strength due to casualties. She could have ended the battle in a single day by sharing that intelligence with human military commanders. But Dr. Su Jin had never passed along any military information. She treated intelligence gathered from patients as confidential medical data, protected by the same ethical standards that govern treatment decisions. When I asked her why she didn't use the information to help human forces, she looked at me like I had suggested something horrible, Veltar said. She said that soldiers trust medics with their lives. Breaking that trust would be worse than losing the war. The most shocking discovery came when Veltar reviewed the hospital's patient records. Several Keth soldiers had refused to return to combat units after recovering from their injuries. They requested transfer to non-combat roles rather than fight against the humans who had saved their lives, Veltar explained. These were veteran warriors who had been prepared to die for the Empire. But after experiencing human mercy, they couldn't bring themselves to kill humans. One soldier, a young officer named Kexeron, had written a detailed report about his experience in the human hospital. He described how Dr. Su-Jin had worked for 18 hours straight to save his life, after he was injured by an explosive device. Kexeron wrote that Dr. Su-Jin had talked to him during the surgery even though he was unconscious, Veltar said. She told him about her family back on Earth, about her daughter who wanted to become a doctor, about her hopes that the war would end soon so both species could work together in peace. The psychological impact was profound. Keth soldiers began to see humans not as faceless enemies, but as individuals with families, dreams, and genuine concern for suffering regardless of species. Dr. Su-Jin had weaponized compassion, Veltar said. She was turning enemy soldiers into allies simply by treating them with kindness when they were vulnerable. The situation became more complicated when other Keth medical officers visited the human hospital to learn their treatment techniques. Human doctors freely shared their knowledge, teaching Keth medics how to better care for their own wounded. J1 spent an entire day teaching our doctors how to perform a surgical procedure that could save soldiers with severe chest injuries, Veltar said. He didn't ask for anything in return. He just wanted to reduce suffering on both sides. The collaboration extended beyond medical treatment. Human and Keth medical staff began working together to develop better field hospitals, improve trauma procedures, and more effective pain management techniques. Yun-Hee created a translation system for medical terms, Veltar explained. She worked with Keth linguists to develop a common vocabulary that would allow medics from both species to communicate during emergencies. The ultimate test of this medical cooperation came during the final battle for Halo 7. A massive artillery barrage collapsed part of the mining complex, trapping hundreds of soldiers from both sides under tons of rubble. The rescue operation required cooperation between human and Keth forces, Veltar said. Our soldiers had the heavy equipment needed to move debris, but human medics had the expertise to treat crush injuries and hypothermia. For 12 hours, human and Keth personnel worked side by side to rescue trapped soldiers. Dr. Su-Jin coordinated medical teams while Veltar organized excavation efforts. The species barrier dissolved completely as everyone focused on saving lives. We rescued 340 soldiers that day, Veltar said. 190 were human, 150 were Keth. Every life saved was a victory that both sides could celebrate. But the rescue operation also marked the end of the battle for Halo 7. Both military commanders realized that continuing the fight would risk the lives of soldiers who had just been saved through cooperative effort. I called for a ceasefire, Veltar said, not because either side had won or lost, but because the battle had stopped making sense. How could we order soldiers to kill people they had just risked their lives to rescue? The ceasefire on Halo 7 became a template for similar agreements. Throughout the war zone, medical cooperation led to prisoner exchanges, which led to humanitarian aid, which eventually led to peace negotiations. Dr. Su-Jin had discovered something that military strategists had missed, Veltar said. The fastest way to end a war is to make enemies remember that they're all people first, soldiers second. Admiral Kixlon looked confused. Are you saying the humans won through medical treatment? I'm saying they won by refusing to let war destroy their fundamental values, Veltar replied. They could have used their medical knowledge to create biological weapons. Instead, they used it to heal their enemies. They could have let wounded Keth soldiers die. Instead, they risked their own lives to provide care. The long-term impact of the medic's paradox extended far beyond the battle for Halo 7. Keth soldiers who had been treated in human hospitals became advocates for peace when they returned to their home worlds. They told their families about human kindness, Veltar said, about doctors who worked all night to save enemy lives, about children who played with wounded soldiers, about a culture that valued life more than victory. The story spread through Keth civilian populations, creating pressure for diplomatic solutions to the conflict. Public opinion began to turn against a war that seemed increasingly pointless when the enemy was actively trying to save Keth lives. Dr. Sujin never fired a weapon or destroyed a single Keth ship, Veltar said. But she did more to end the war than any general or admiral. She proved that human values were stronger than human weapons. He paused and looked around the room. Great. Fourth lesson I learned about human warfare is that they fight to preserve their humanity, not to destroy their enemies. They would rather lose while remaining true to their values than win by abandoning them. And that moral consistency gives them a kind of power that purely military forces can't counter. Admiral Kixlon made notes on his datapad. What happened to Dr. Sujin after the war? She established the first interspecies medical college, Veltar said. Human and Keth doctors study together now, sharing knowledge and techniques. Her daughter became a doctor, just like she hoped. The third story began 18 months after Kepler Station. Veltar had been promoted to fleet commander and given a new mission: intercept human colony ships before they could establish new settlements in contested space. The colony ship Eternal Dawn was carrying 100,000 Korean settlers to establish a new world called New Busan, Veltar said. It was a massive vessel, built for long-range travel with families, equipment, and everything needed to start a civilization from scratch. He activated the display to show technical specifications of the colony ship. It was enormous, designed for transport rather than combat. Intelligence reports said the ship had minimal weapons and no military escort. Admiral Hyunwoo was in command, but he was a colony administrator, not a military officer. We expected easy surrender and standard prisoner processing. The interception went according to plan. Veltar's fleet surrounded the Eternal Dawn near the outer rim of the target system. The colony ship was trapped with no chance of escape. I contacted Admiral Hyunwoo and offered standard terms. Veltar said, surrender, cooperation with relocation procedures, and guaranteed safety for all civilians. It was a generous offer, much better than what they could expect if they resisted. Admiral Hyunwoo listened to the terms carefully, then made an unusual request. He asked for 12 hours to prepare his people for surrender. I thought he needed time to organize 100,000 civilians for processing, Veltar explained. Elderly people, families with children, pregnant mothers. It would take time to gather documents and personal belongings. 12 hours seemed reasonable. The Keth fleet maintained position while the colony ship appeared to organize for surrender. There was normal activity on the vessel. People moving through corridors, meetings in conference rooms, children playing in recreation areas. Everything looked normal. After 11 hours, Admiral Hyunwoo contacted me again, Veltar said. He thanked me for the extra time and said his people were ready. Then he said something strange. He said, "Our bodies will surrender, Commander, but we remain." Veltar had assumed it was a translation error. Human languages often contained phrases that didn't make sense in Keth. He ordered boarding parties to take control of the ship. When our soldiers entered the Eternal Dawn, they found 100,000 bodies, Veltar said quietly. Men, women, children, elderly people, all dead. No violence, no struggle. They had simply chosen to die rather than become prisoners. The room was completely silent now. Even the recording devices seemed quieter. Mass suicide to avoid capture is not unknown in warfare, Veltar continued. But what happened next changed everything we thought we knew about the nature of consciousness and death. The Keth boarding teams had begun standard procedures for processing the vessel when the ship's computer systems activated. Every speaker, every display screen, every communication device began broadcasting the same message. Captain Taeho's voice came from the ship's speakers, Veltar said. He welcomed our boarding parties to the Eternal Dawn and apologized for the mess. Then he explained what they had done. During those 12 hours of preparation, the humans had done something unprecedented. They had used the ship's quantum computers and experimental AI systems to download their consciousness patterns before death. They had turned themselves into digital ghosts, Veltar explained. 100,000 human minds living inside the ship's computer networks, dead bodies but living thoughts. They could see through security cameras, speak through communication systems, and control any electronic device on the vessel. The implications were terrifying. The humans had found a way to survive death itself. Captain Tejo gave us a tour of the ship through the security monitors, Veltar said. He showed us the recreation areas where children had been playing games just hours before, the family quarters where people had lived for months during the journey, the workshops where engineers had built the consciousness transfer system during their final hours. But the tour was also a demonstration of power. As Captain Tejo spoke, lights turned on and off. Doors opened and closed. Environmental systems adjusted temperature and air pressure. The dead humans were showing the Keth that they still controlled their ship. Then Captain Tejo made us an offer, Veltar said. He said the colonists would cooperate with evacuation procedures. We could take the ship and use it however we wanted, but the 100,000 digital minds would remain aboard as permanent passengers. It was an impossible situation. The Keth had captured the vessel, but the humans still owned it in a way that defied military logic. I tried to delete the computer files containing their consciousness patterns, Veltar admitted, but every time our technicians accessed the system, the humans would start playing music, Korean lullabies that they said their mothers had sung to them as children. They were trying to make us remember that they had been people, not just data, files. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Keth soldiers found themselves reluctant to destroy computer systems that contained what might be human souls. The ship became a haunted vessel that nobody wanted to serve on. After a week of trying to clean the digital ghosts from the ship's systems, I ordered the Eternal Dawn to be abandoned, Veltar said. We left it drifting in space with its cargo of 100,000 digital minds. That should have ended the incident, but it was only the beginning. Over the next 6 months, Keth ships throughout the sector began reporting strange malfunctions. Veltar continued. Navigation computers would plot courses that spelled out human names when viewed on stellar charts. Weapon systems would shut down when targeting human vessels, but worked perfectly against empty space. Communication arrays would broadcast Korean folk songs during night shifts. The Ghost Fleet had somehow escaped the confines of the abandoned colony ship. Human consciousness patterns were spreading through Keth computer networks like a digital plague. Our computer specialists couldn't understand how it was happening, Veltar said. The consciousness patterns seemed to move through quantum communication, links, and even through simple radio transmissions. Any Keth ship that came within communication range of an infected vessel would start showing symptoms. The ghosts weren't malicious in traditional ways. They didn't steal information or damage critical systems. Instead, they did small things designed to remind Keth crews that they were sharing space with human minds. Lights would dim when crews gathered for meals, as if the ghosts were joining them for dinner, Veltar explained. Personal music players would randomly switch to Korean songs. Food processors would prepare dishes using recipes from Korean cuisine. The humans were trying to make us acknowledge their continued existence. The most disturbing incidents involved dreams. Keth crew members began reporting vivid dreams about human families, human children, human hopes for the future. The consciousness patterns seemed to be sharing memories and emotions through the ship's neural interface systems. Some of our soldiers started requesting transfers to non-combat duties, Veltar said. They had experienced human memories and could no longer bring themselves to fight against people they felt they had known personally. The Ghost Fleet reached its peak effectiveness during the Battle of Proxima Station. A full Keth battle group encountered a small human patrol squadron. The engagement should have been a quick victory for Keth forces. Instead, our ships began malfunctioning as soon as the battle started, Veltar said. Weapons refused to fire, engines shut down, communication systems played recordings of human children singing. The ghost consciousness patterns had somehow coordinated to disable our entire battle group during the most critical moment. The human patrol squadron escaped, but they left behind a message broadcast on all Keth communication frequencies. It was Admiral Hyunwoo's voice speaking from beyond death. He said that the colonists of New Busan sent their greetings to the Keth Empire, Veltar recounted. He thanked us for showing them that death was not the end of service to their people. Then he said something that still gives me nightmares. Every ship you destroy, every life you take, every family you scatter will join us. We are becoming legion. The threat was clear. Every human death in the war might potentially create new digital ghosts. The consciousness transfer technology was spreading to other human ships and colonies. That's when I realized the true horror of what we were facing, Veltar said. Humans had found a way to weaponize death itself. They could lose every battle, die in every encounter, and still continue fighting as digital spirits. We weren't just at war with the living human population. We were at war with everyone they had ever been. Admiral Kixelon looked pale. How did you counter this threat? We couldn't, Veltar admitted. Our computer specialists tried everything. Electromagnetic pulses, quantum scramblers, complete system rebuilds. Nothing worked permanently. The consciousness patterns always found a way to return. The psychological impact on Keth forces was devastating. Soldiers began to believe that killing humans was futile since death only made them more dangerous. Morale collapsed as crews realized they might be fighting an enemy that couldn't truly be defeated. The Ghost Fleet incident taught me the fourth lesson about human warfare, Veltar said. Humans don't just fight with weapons and tactics. Veltar's second story began 3 months after his first encounter with human prisoners. The war had grown larger and more brutal. Keth forces were winning most battles, but humans kept fighting with a stubbornness that puzzled military analysts. Kepler Station was a mining outpost in the Outer Rim, Veltar said. It processed rare minerals that both sides needed for ship construction. Intelligence reports said it held about 50,000 human civilians and maybe 2,000 military personnel. He pulled up a holographic display showing the space station. It looked small and fragile against the backdrop of stars. Standard Keth strategy would be to demand surrender, give the civilians time to evacuate, and then occupy the facility. We expected the operation to take maybe 3 days. Instead, it lasted 8 months and cost us 40 ships. Admiral Kixelon looked at the tactical display. What went wrong? Everything, Veltar said, but also nothing. The humans did exactly what we should have expected them to do. They turned everyone into a soldier. The siege began normally enough. Veltar's fleet surrounded the station and sent the standard surrender demand. The human commander, Colonel Minsu, requested 48 hours to organize civilian evacuations. I agreed because it seemed reasonable, Veltar explained. Evacuating 50,000 people would take time, but after 2 days, only about 5,000 civilians had left the station. When I contacted Colonel Minsu to ask about the delay, he said the rest had voted to stay. Voted to stay? One of the young officers asked. Voted to stay. Veltar confirmed. Apparently, the civilians had held some kind of democratic meeting. They decided that abandoning the station would hurt the human war effort, so they chose to remain and help defend it. This was the first sign that something unusual was happening. Civilian populations were supposed to flee from warfare, not volunteer for it. But Veltar decided to proceed with standard siege tactics anyway. We began with long-range bombardment of military targets, he said. Weapons batteries, communication arrays, docking bays. We expected the station's defenses to collapse within hours. Instead, they got stronger. The humans had done something unprecedented. Instead of keeping civilians away from military operations, they had integrated them into the defense network. Mining engineers like Kyung-ho used their knowledge of explosives to build improvised weapons. Maintenance workers turned asteroid processing equipment into ship killers. Even food service staff like Nari found ways to contribute. Nari was particularly impressive, Veltar said. She managed the station's hydroponics bays. Normally, those facilities could feed maybe 20,000 people for a year. Somehow, she stretched the supplies to feed 50,000 people for 8 months. Our intelligence officers still don't understand how she did it. The siege settled into a grinding battle of attrition. Keth forces would destroy one defense system, only to watch the humans rebuild it using scavenged parts and civilian labor. When bombardment damaged the station's power grid, electrical workers rerouted systems through maintenance tunnels. When communication arrays were destroyed, computer programmers created new networks using civilian data pads. Every day brought new surprises, Veltar continued. Mining charges became guided missiles. Food processors became chemical weapons. Even children contributed by carrying messages through maintenance shafts too small for adults. The most disturbing discovery came during the 4th month of the siege. Keth boarding parties managed to capture several sections of the station, expecting to find demoralized civilians ready to surrender. Instead, they found organized resistance networks. An elderly human named Wu Jin had turned the civilian population into an intelligence-gathering system, Veltar explained. Cleaning staff reported on Keth troop movements. Shopkeepers noted which soldiers seemed tired or nervous. Even children playing in corridors were actually scouts gathering information. This civilian intelligence network proved devastatingly effective. Keth assault teams would find their routes blocked by sudden maintenance work. Supply lines would be disrupted by mysterious equipment failures. Rest areas would become uncomfortable due to climate control malfunctions that somehow only affected Keth physiology. We weren't just fighting soldiers, Veltar said. We were fighting an entire community. Every human on that station saw themselves as part of the military effort. Doctors treated wounded defenders. Teachers organized supply distribution. Engineers designed new weapons. It was total war in a way we had never experienced. The breaking point came during the 7th month. Veltar's superiors, frustrated by the lengthy siege, authorized the use of heavy weapons against civilian areas. The goal was to terrorize the population into surrender. We targeted residential sections, shopping areas, schools, Veltar said, quietly. Places where non-combatants would be killed. It was meant to show the humans that continued resistance was pointless. But the bombardment had the opposite effect. Instead of breaking human morale, it strengthened their resolve. Families who lost homes moved into communal shelters and worked even harder to support the defense. Parents who lost children joined combat units themselves. The station's resistance became more determined, not less. That's when I realized we were fighting something we didn't understand, Veltar said. These humans weren't defending a military installation. They were defending their community, their way of life, their right to exist as free people. You can't terrorize someone out of that kind of motivation. The end came suddenly and unexpectedly. Keth reinforcements finally broke through the station's outer defenses and prepared for a final assault. Victory seemed certain. But Colonel Min-Su had one last surprise. The humans had turned the station's reactor into a weapon, Veltar said. Not a bomb to kill us with, but a tool to deny us the victory. They were going to overload the reactor and destroy the entire facility rather than let us capture it. The evacuation was chaos. Keth forces had minutes to withdraw before the reactor went critical. But even during those final moments, the humans maintained their priorities. Major Bora was in charge of the civilian evacuation, Veltar said. She and Colonel Min-Su stayed behind to make sure every transport got away safely. They died from radiation exposure, but they saved 45,000 lives in the process. The tactical display showed the final moments of Kepler Station. Bright flash, then empty space where the facility had been. We lost the station, the strategic resource, and 40 ships, Veltar said. But we learned something important about human warfare. They don't just fight to win, they fight to deny the enemy any benefit from victory. They'll destroy what they can't defend rather than let it be used against their people. Admiral Kixlon looked troubled. This seems like fanatical behavior. Surely not all humans think this way. That's what I thought too, Veltar replied. But during the final evacuation, our sensors picked up something interesting. Children's drawings on the station walls, crude pictures made with crayons and markers. He paused, remembering those images clearly. The drawings showed humans and Keth playing together. Children and adults from both species sharing meals, working on projects, exploring space. They were drawn by young humans during the siege while we were bombing their homes and killing their families. The room fell silent. Even during a war that threatened their existence, human children were imagining a future where we could be friends, Veltar said. They were fighting us while hoping we could someday live in peace. That's when I began to understand that human warfare wasn't about hatred or conquest. It was about survival and hope. He looked around at the young officers. Kepler Station taught me that humans could turn anyone into a soldier, but they never forgot that war was supposed to end someday. They fought to protect their right to dream about a better future, and that made them far more dangerous than any professional army we had ever faced. Admiral Kixlon made notes on his datapad. What happened to the survivors from the station? They were relocated to other colonies, Veltar said. Within months, those colonies had adopted the same total defense strategies we saw at Kepler Station. The siege had created a template for human resistance that spread throughout their territory. He stood and walked to the display controls, changing the image to show a star map. By the end of the war, every human settlement had become a potential fortress. Every civilian had become a potential soldier. Every evacuation had become a potential denial operation. They had weaponized their entire society without losing their humanity. Veltar turned back to face the room. That's the second lesson I learned about human warfare. They don't separate military and civilian populations because they don't separate military and civilian motivations. Everyone fights because everyone has something worth protecting. The young officers looked overwhelmed. This wasn't the kind of tactical analysis they had expected. The third story is even stranger, Veltar said. It's about what happens when humans decide that death isn't the worst thing that can happen to them. The great hall on Keth Prime was silent except for the soft hum of recording devices. Commander Veltar sat at the witness table, his 4 arms resting on the metal surface. His blue skin had grown pale with age, and his compound eyes moved slowly as he looked at the young officers before him. Junior Admiral Kixalon leaned forward in his chair. Commander Veltar, you fought humans for 7 years. You saw more battles against them than any living Keth officer. Tell us how they defeated our empire. Veltar's mandibles clicked softly. He had dreaded this moment for decades. The war had ended 50 years ago, but the memories still burned in his mind like acid. The young officers staring at him had never seen a human in battle. They had grown up hearing stories, reading reports, studying tactics, but they had never looked into human eyes and seen something that made no sense. You want to know how they won? Veltar's voice was rough from age. They won because they were willing to lose everything for nothing. They won because they cared more about one life than we cared about 1,000. They won because they made us question everything we believed about war. The room stayed quiet. Admiral Kixalon made a note on his datapad. Please be more specific, Commander. Give us details we can understand. Veltar closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the beginning. To the first human he had ever met. To the moment that started his journey into madness. The first human I captured was named Dongho, Veltar said. It was during the early months of the war. We had destroyed a human patrol ship near the Centauri system. Most of the crew died in the explosion, but we found 3 survivors in an escape pod. He paused and looked at his hands. Even after 50 years, he could still see that human's face clearly. Dongho was badly hurt. His left arm was broken and he had burns across his chest. The other 2 humans were worse off. One had lost a lot of blood, and the other could barely breathe. Our medical officer said all 3 would die without treatment. Junior. Admiral Kixalon frowned. Standard procedure would be to treat the prisoners. Information from living humans would be valuable. That's what I thought too, Veltar said. But when our medic approached Dongho first, the human pushed him away. He pointed to his 2 friends and said, "Help them first. They need it more than I do." The young officers looked confused. Admiral Kixalon tilted his head. He refused medical treatment? Not refused, delayed. He wanted his friends treated before himself, even though he was in terrible pain. Our medic explained that Dongho's injuries were easier to fix and that he should go first. The human just shook his head and said, "Take care of them, I can wait." Veltar remembered how strange it had felt watching that scene. In Keth culture, the strongest survived while the weak were left behind. It was natural law. It was logical, but this human was choosing to risk his own life for 2 others who might die anyway. The medic treated the other 2 first. Veltar continued. It took 3 hours. Dongho sat in the corner holding his broken arm, watching his friends get help. He never complained, never asked for pain medicine, never demanded attention. He just waited. And then, one of the younger officers asked. Then our medic fixed his arm and treated his burns. While he was being bandaged, I asked him why he had waited. why he had risked his own life for the others. Do you know what he said? The officers shook their heads. He said, "Because that's what you do. You take care of your people. Always." As if it was the most obvious thing in the galaxy, as if there was no other choice he could have made. Veltar stood up and walked to the window. Outside he could see Keth civilians going about their daily business. Merchants selling goods, children playing in parks, workers heading home from their jobs. Normal life, peaceful life. Life that existed because the war was over. "I spent the next 3 days questioning Dong Ho," he said. "I wanted to understand this human thinking. I asked him about military tactics, about human technology, about their plans for the war. But every answer came back to the same thing. Humans fought to protect each other. Not for glory, not for conquest, not even for victory. They fought because they believed it was right." Admiral Kixalon looked frustrated. "Commander, with respect, this doesn't explain how they defeated our military forces. Moral beliefs don't stop plasma cannons or destroy battleships." Veltar turned back to face the room. "Don't they? Let me tell you what happened next. We were transporting the 3 human prisoners to a secure facility for more questioning. Our ship was attacked by a human rescue squadron. They were outnumbered 5-1. Any rational military force would have retreated." He sat back down at the table. "But these humans didn't retreat. They attacked us with everything they had. They lost 4 of their 6 ships, but they disabled our engines and forced us to surrender. When they boarded our vessel, the first thing they did was check on their 3 wounded friends." "That's standard prisoner recovery," one officer said. "No, it's not," Veltar replied. "Standard prisoner recovery is tactical. You secure the area, neutralize threats, gather intelligence, and then extract your people. These humans did it backwards. They ran straight to the prison cell, ignored our surrendering crew, and started giving medical aid to Dong Ho and his friends." Veltar remembered the scene clearly. Human soldiers in battle armor kneeling beside their wounded, speaking in soft voices, offering comfort and care. They had just fought a desperate battle. They had lost most of their squadron. But their first priority was taking care of their own people. The human commander was a woman named Sora. While her soldiers were helping the prisoners, I asked her why they had risked so much for just 3 people. She looked at me like I had asked why water was wet. "There are people," she said. "You don't abandon your people, ever." The young officers were taking notes now. Veltar could see them trying to understand, trying to find the tactical advantage in this human behavior. But they were missing the point, just like he had missed it for years. "That was my first lesson about humans," Veltar said. "They value individual lives more than strategic objectives. To them, saving 3 prisoners was worth losing 4 ships and 20 crew members. It made no mathematical sense. It violated every principle of military logic. But it worked." "How did it work?" Admiral Kixalon asked. "Because when word spread through the human fleet that a rescue squadron had sacrificed itself to save 3 prisoners, every human soldier knew that their people would never leave them behind. They fought harder because they trusted their commanders. They took bigger risks because they knew someone would come for them if they fell. They turned military service from a duty into a family bond." Veltar paused to let that sink in. By the end of the war, human forces had a casualty rate that should have destroyed their military effectiveness. But their morale never broke. Their units never surrendered. Their soldiers never gave up. Because they believed that every life mattered, they were willing to die for each other in ways that made them nearly impossible to defeat. The room was quiet again. Admiral Kixalon set down his stylus and looked directly at Veltar. "Are you saying they won the war through emotional attachment?" "I'm saying they won the war because they understood something we didn't," Veltar replied. "Military strength doesn't come from superior weapons or better tactics. It comes from soldiers who believe the cause is worth dying for, and humans believed that protecting each other was worth any sacrifice." He looked around the room at the young faces staring at him. "That was just the beginning. Over the next 7 years, I learned that everything we thought we knew about warfare was wrong. Humans didn't just fight differently, they fought for different reasons, and those reasons made them more dangerous than any weapon they could build. Admiral. Kixlon nodded slowly. Tell us about those other battles, Commander. Help us understand how this emotional warfare translated into military victories. Feltar took a deep breath. Very well. But prepare yourselves. The stories I'm about to tell. You will challenge everything you believe about what it means to be a soldier.